Ciao a tutti e bentornati sul mio canale. O se è la prima volta mi guardi, benvenuti. Mi chiamo Matt di Matt's Bookshelf e oggi sto parlando di un buon libro, un libro classico nella lingua di italiano. E questo è Il Gattopardo o The Leopard in inglese. Written by Giuseppe di Lampedusa and published in 1858, The Leopard is considered an Italian classic. And I come across this book randomly. I was just Googling Italian classic novels because I want to get more into the subject, and The Leopard was pretty common in the articles that I read as one of the best. And now having read it and having had really high expectations for it, I can honestly say I know why this is a classic, because The Leopard is probably going to be one of the best books I will read this year, and probably a book that I will actively want to read as I get older later in life, as I'll go into more in this review. This is a little background though before I get into the book itself, because every video now is history lesson for me, because I can't resist it. For the author is very interesting because, first of all, this is an extremely well-written book, and I want to read more novels by Giuseppe di Lampedusa, but unfortunately, this is the only novel he's written as far as I'm aware. He's written some short stories, but The Leopard was his life's work. Going into some of the plot here, he was an heir to like a lesser royal family in Sicily growing up, and eventually would leave Sicily and live in London, I believe. And during his whole life, as he watched Italy change before him, he was sort of meditating on this book and coming up and writing the book as throughout his whole life. He was able to be about 60 and trying to get it published later in his life, but it was considered to be unpublishable at the time. But then a year after his death, it was published and would go on to be one of the best-selling Italian books ever. So it's very unfortunate, because this book is extremely well-written and extremely deep and thoughtful and thought-provoking. And it's just unfortunate that this is the only book we have from Giuseppe di Lampedusa. But if you know of any other short stories that are easily accessible, or if he does have any other books that are out there, let me know, because I'd be very interested in reading more from him. So the book follows Fabrizio Salina, who is the proverbial leopard. He is a lesser lord under a Bourbon king who rules the kingdom of the two Sicilies. And Fabrizio lives in Sicily, obviously, and in the Donna Fugata, which is a palace somewhat near Palermo. I'm not familiar with Sicilian geography, but I know Palermo is currently the capital of Sicily, so he lives near Palermo. And he's currently ruling and living in a time of like the mid-1800s of Italy. And if you don't know what's going on this time, it is a very, very important historical movement and moment in Italian and probably in European history, which is called the Risorgimento. And if you don't know what that is, at the time, Italy was not what it is today. It was divided by city-states. It was divided by other empires, that being the French aristocracy at the time under Napoleon III, and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire as well, all sort of vying for land in Italy. So it was very divided at this moment. And the Risorgimento would lead to a unified Italy that we see today. It would occur throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s, and would eventually be completely unified post-World War I, when the Austrian-Hungarian alliance collapsed. In addition to the Risorgimento, a very more specific historical event is going on in Sicily, and it's affecting the kingdom of the two Sicilies, which would eventually lead to its downfall, and that is the Expedition of the Thousand, which was Giuseppe Garibaldi's invasion of Sicily in order to take down the Bourbon king of the kingdom of the two Sicilies. And of course, being a vassal lord to the Bourbon king, Fabrizio Salina is very worried about this movement, and he's worried about his power being taken away from him. And throughout this book, you see the effects of war, and both how it affects royalty and how royalty is also blind to the actual horrors of war at the same time. Fabrizio has a very large family, and most of them are very passive people. He has one son who completely abandoned his family in the royal line because he'd rather live in London. So it's showing that at this moment times are changing, because being royalty doesn't really mean what it used to, as one of his sons proves, because he would rather make a living on his own than and then live in the Donna Fugata, which was their estate, and live out his life in royalty and potential luxury, but as you go on to see, it's not really the case. He has a nephew named Tancredi, who is a younger man, probably in his late teens, early 20s, who is a red shirt, and that is someone who is a follower of Garibaldi and believes in Garibaldi's cause. That being the Youthful Italy movement, which was started by Giuseppe Mazzini and was sort of the belief that Italy should be unified as one entity under one kingdom. And that is sort of like the philosophical movement that, the philosophical and political movement that sort of led to Vittorio Emanuele and Giuseppe Garibaldi coming into power and inciting that desire to unify Italy in the first place. And so, as I said, Tancredi is a follower of this belief. He thinks that Italy should be unified, and he's relatively okay with Garibaldi coming in and potentially taking away some of the, potentially dethroning the Bourbon king at this time. And he goes further with this movement by courting and becoming engaged with a woman named Angelica, who is the daughter of a mayor in Sicily, and this mayor is not of royal blood. Fabrizio, who's the main character, the Leopard himself, just calls him a peasant, but at the same time, he's richer. He has more money and more wealth than the Leopard, than the royalty, than the royal line itself. And that's just one of the ways this great book shows how the transition of power is slowly occurring and how Fabrizio can do nothing about it. And then throughout this book, it sort of follows Fabrizio sort of coming to terms with the fact that he's losing his power. He's very detached from what's going on, but at the same time, he knows it's sort of slowly creeping up that war is coming, and it's right by his doorstep. When he goes out into the city, there's dead soldiers lying on the ground. There's young people in the street looking at him disdainfully. He does not really hold the reverence that he once did, and yet he still has that sort of that sort of condescending look on the peasant class, on people who are not born of royal line. He doesn't really understand why Tancredi would want to marry into this family, would want to marry Angelica and get into this family of people who are not of a royal bloodline, but he sort of has to go along with it anyways because he does love Tancredi, and eventually he goes on to love and probably be like sexually in love with Tancredi's fiancée, Angelica. But there's an emphasis in this book on royal ignorance or rich ignorance, whereas, as I said earlier, the war is affecting them, but not in the violent way that's affecting soldiers and normal people. And I think there's a passage here that I want to read that kind of sums that up well from Lampedusa's perspective. Today, as political calm had cleared the mist generally veiling it, the prince's fundamental good nature showed on the surface. To reassure his daughter, he began explaining what useless muskets the royal army had. The barrels of those enormous pieces had no rifling, he said. No bullets coming from them would have very little penetration. Technical comments thought up on the spur of the moment, understood by few and convincing none, but consoling all, including Concetta, as they managed to transform war into a neat diagram of fire trajectories from a very squalid and very positive chaos that it really was. So the royal family, and Concetta is Fabrizio's daughter, are learning from their generals about the war that's coming. I like the idea that war for them is just plain dry talk of technical army speak and maps, and it's very detached from the actual violence that's going on in Sicily and in Italy at this time. It sort of reminds me of the Romanov dynasty towards the end of the Russian royal line and then the rise of the Soviet Union, where Nicholas II was, and his family were very unaware of the actual brutalities of war and all of the chaos that was going on in Russia at the time, and sort of the revolution that came was somewhat of a surprise to them, because despite hearing about all the atrocities and being somewhat aware of them, it's not the same as being there. They don't suffer like the poor do in Russia. They are living lives of luxury up until the very end, and it sort of reminds me of this here, where their lives are so restricted to lives of luxury, and the Salina family is so used to life of luxury that actual suffering doesn't really occur to them as being something more than just stories and dry talk. So it sort of shows that with the youth and for like the lower classes in Italy and in Sicily, and the kingdom of the two Sicilies at this time, you can really understand why Garibaldi and Vittorio Emanuele be such appealing forces to them, because their own ruling class just doesn't really understand their struggles and doesn't really believe that their power is going away until it's like the very last moment. And I think that's really beautifully conveyed here in The Leopard. And because Giuseppe di Lampedusa, there's a lot of Giuseppes here, so just to clarify, Giuseppe Garibaldi was a general who was very much in charge of unifying Italy. Giuseppe Mazzini founded the Youthful Italian movement, which was the political movement that sort of lighted the spark of this unification of Italy. And Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa is the author. And because Giuseppe Tomasi, the author, is very connected to this sort of life, I think it's really beautifully conveyed here, very realistically conveyed. In addition to the story, which I think perfectly entwines familial struggles, familial drama with real life drama, real historical drama at the time, the writing itself is kind of magnificent. I would compare both his writing style and his view of the upper class as being like the Italian, as being kind of like the Italian Scott Fitzgerald, where it's a very sort of honest, it's very tragic in a way, but it's also there's also some hints of condescending nature towards the upper class at the same time, both in the beautiful writing and in like the character work. I'm going to read another section here that I think is really, really magnificently well told. So this is when Fabrizio Cellina is leaving Madonna Fugata and is going to Palermo, and I'm going to read like the description of Sicily as followed. The countryside spread below in all its beauty. Under the levin of the strong sun, everything seemed weightless. The sea in the background was a dash of pure color. The mountains, which had seemed so alarmingly full of hidden men during the night, now looked like masses of vapor on the point of dissolving. The grim Palermo itself lay crouching quietly around its convents, like a flock of sheep around their shepherds. Even the foreign warships anchored in the harbor in case of trouble spread no sense of fear in the majestic calm. The sun, which was still far from its blazing zenith on that morning of the 13th of May, showed itself to be the true ruler of Sicily. The crude, brash sun, the drugging sun, which annulled every will, kept all things in servile immobility, cradled in violence, as arbitrary as dreams. So I could probably talk on and on about this book, but I think that the less you know going into it, the better, because the sort of philosophical ideas discussed in this book are kind of incredible. I'll go vaguely into them because I'm very excited about this book and I want to talk about it. So when I said earlier about me wanting to read this later in life, my dad actually has read this book, and he's about like 40 years older than me, and there are a lot of, with Fabrizio's character, who was an older man, sort of coming to terms with change, sort of coming to terms with his own mortality, that he said that he could relate to more than me. And it's even mentioned in this book that the young members of his family don't understand the closest of death that I do, that being Fabrizio. And, you know, when I'm an older man, I think I could read this book and get more out of Fabrizio's character. And having to come to terms with the fact that power is slowly drifting away, both politically and physical power, because Cellina's, you know, age is getting to his body. He can't move like he used to, and he gets more tired easily. And that stuff I think I would get more out of as I get older. And it goes to show that the rereadability of this book will probably hit me differently later on. And there's a lot of attention to rich sort of descriptions, that being, you know, descriptions of like really elaborate churches, really elaborate dress, huge balls, that being dances, not the other kind of balls. Like all these like really extravagant rich things, but there's like this grossness and this sign of decay to everything there that is, you know, unmistakable, and a lot of it's noticed by Fabrizio himself as he gets older. And I'll read another passage as followed. The ballroom was all golden, smooth on the cornices, uneven on the door frames, in a pale, almost silvery design against a darker background on the door panels and on the shutters annulling the windows, thus conferring on the room the look of some superb jewel case shut off from an unworthy world. It was not the flashy gilding which decorators slap on nowadays, but a faded gold, pale as the hair of Nordic children, determinedly hiding its value under a muted use of precious material intended to let beauty be seen and cost forgotten. Here and there on the panels were knots of rocco flowers in a color so faint as to seem just an ephemeral pink reflected from the chandeliers. That solar hue, that variegation of gleam and shade, made Don Fabrizio's heart ache as he stood black and stiff in the doorway. This eminently patrician room reminded him of country things. The chromatic scale was the same as that of the vast wheat fields around the Donna Fugazza, wrapped, begging pity from the tyrannous sun. In this room, too, as on his estates in mid-August, the harvest had been gathered long before, stacked everywhere, leaving, as here, a sole reminder in the color of stubble burned and useless now. The notes of the waltz and the warm air seemed to him but a stylization of the incessant winds harping their own sorrows on the parched surfaces today, yesterday, tomorrow, forever, and forever. The crowd of dancers, among whom he could count so many near to him in blood, if not in heart, began to seem unreal, made up of that material from which are woven lapsed memories, more elusive even than the stuff of disturbing dreams. From the ceiling, the gods, reclining on gilded couches, gazed down smiling and inexorable as a summer sky. They thought themselves eternal, but a bomb manufactured in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was to prove the contrary in 1943. So there's great magnificence in the Selina family and in this aristocracy in the Kingdom of the Sicilies, but also there's this acknowledgement that all of it's fading, from the architecture, which I mentioned earlier, to even the people, as in this ballroom scene, Fabrizio's looking around and he's seeing women that were sort of concubines to him when he was younger have aged as well. Everything's fading, everything is passing on, and Fabrizio is just sort of very passively letting it happen because there's nothing he can do about it. And as I said in that last sentence there about the bomb blowing up in 1943, there are instances where Tomasi will give us allusions to what will happen to characters later on in their lives and things we don't see in the book, sort of adding to this idea that despite the richness, the regalness of their lives, they'll never really be happy, whether it be because of their own egos or because of the world they live in and the changing societal classes. But there's a lot of tragedy in this book, and I think it's so beautifully executed. I really can just gush about this book on and on, but at some point you have to read it on your own because this book is kind of phenomenal, and it's really stuck with me since I finished reading it about a week ago, and I'm going to try to read more Italian classic literature as things go on. So that's my review. I really hope that you enjoyed it. I really hope you check this out because honestly, I want to talk about this book with someone. So if you have read it, let me know, because I would be honestly maybe willing to do a video with you because I want to talk about this book because I want to get more spoilers into this. But I won't because I want everyone to read it. So check out my other videos. I just did a book haul video last week. I am continuing my Richard Ulysses videos as well. I will probably be having an Exiles review, which is James Lucas's only play, coming out next week. Started the script, see how that goes. And if you want to see more videos like this, let me know. I'm going to have some more book reviews coming out later on as well. I kind of want to do some more writing videos too. We'll see. But check out my friends Tyler Talks and Drenzo. I'll leave their channels, and Film Prize as well. I will leave their channels in the description below. E vuoi guardare altri video in italiano o la lettura di italiano, fatemelo sapere nei commenti. Sono sotto qui, sì, vero? Ci vediamo nella prossima video e a presto, ciao!